Okay, I'm going to start talking about the US government-funded organizations driving the anti-government protests here in Thailand. I'm going to go over all of the evidence so people can see with their own eyes that this is for real. We're going to start with Thai Lawyers for Human Rights because they're involved in virtually every aspect of the anti-government protests right now. They're an organization that provides free legal services for the protesters and especially the core leaders of the protests. They also use their large social media presence to promote the protests. And some of their staff are even involved directly in leading the protests. This includes Anon Nampa. He's a lawyer with Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. And if we take a look at this Reuters article, the bookish Thai rights lawyer who challenged the king, we can see that he's right at the center of the anti-government and anti-monarchy protests. And Reuters will not get into who he works for and who funds the organization he works for. But we can go to another website, Frontline Defenders. It's a Western corporate foundation funded front supporting the work of people like Anon Nampa. And they describe him as a human rights defender and a human rights lawyer. And his affiliation is with Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. So who funds Thai Lawyers for Human Rights and where can we see the evidence for this? You go to the US government's National Endowment for Democracy's website. They have an official website, NED.org. You go to regions, you go to Asia, you scroll down to Thailand, and you can find a full disclosure like this with all of the programs that the US government is funding inside of Thailand. And this is the 2014 disclosure. And if we go down to the near bottom of the list, we find Union for Civil Liberty. And we see Thai Lawyers for Human Rights mentioned by name here, and it's hosted by the Union for Civil Liberty, whose official website is here. This is the current website, by the way, and you see Thai Lawyers for Human Rights is listed as a member of this organization. Now, it's important to remember because the most recent disclosure by the US NED only lists the Union for Civil Liberty and doesn't break down the funding that each organization under it is receiving. Now, the US NED was created by the US government. It's funded annually by US Congress, and it's overseen by Congress and the US State Department. So when they try to claim that it's a private organization and doesn't constitute US government funding when it's dispersing these funds to organizations like Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, it's just not true. It's a front that the US government is laundering money through to fund foreign interference around the globe. That's what the US NED does. Now, if you don't really take that serious, if a U.S. government website admitting that it's funding these organizations and funding Thai Lawyers for Human Rights specifically, the founders themselves have admitted it in the past. This is an article from 2016. It's in the Bangkok Post. This is about one of the co-founders, Silikan Chalern Seli. They give a lot of background about her work and also the creation of Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. When we come down here, we see this. This is admitted in the Bangkok Post. The group later received funding from the European Union to set up a new office at Sapan Kwai, and it now has over 20 full-time staff. These are all people that are being paid. It now receives all its funding from international donors, including the EU, Germany, and US-based human rights organizations and embassies of the UK and Canada. So all of their support comes from overseas, from foreign governments, and they right now are engaged in anti-government protests aimed at not only overthrowing the Thai government, but they claim reforming the monarchy, but it's quite clear that they're trying to also remove the monarchy. We also have this interview that Prachatai, which is also funded by the US NED. This is an interview by Prachatai with Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, and the founder admits right here. We have to thank many organizations which support us, such as ILAW, funded by the U.S. government, Cross Cultural Foundation, also funded by the U.S. government, International Commission of Jurists, United Nations, European Union, British Embassy, Canadian Embassy, among others. And of course, the U.S. government is among others. Now, the U.S. support for Thai Lawyers for Human Rights is not confined just to financial support. They also provide a lot of different kinds of political support. For instance, when members of Thai Lawyers for Human Rights are called in for charges of sedition, you'll see staff from the US Embassy, Canadian Embassy, UK Embassy accompany them to the police station to hear charges. Here is the 2018 US State Department International Women of Courage Award. And this is a statement made by the US Embassy and Consulate in Thailand recognizing this award being given to Sirikan Chalernseli, the co-founder of Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. So it's very clear. And this is an award that she had to travel to Washington, D.C. to the U.S. State Department to receive from the U.S. First Lady, the wife of the U.S. President. So knowing all of that, seeing all of that with your own eyes, the disclosures by the U.S. NED and the admissions from the co-founders themselves and the U.S. State Department itself providing political support to Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, we still have the U.S. Embassy come out twice, at least twice now, to deny supporting or funding the protesters in any way. And this is a article in The Nation, and it's from September 10th, 2020. And the U.S. Embassy says, the United States government is not funding or otherwise providing support to any of the protests in Thailand. The United States does not support any individual or political party. We support the democratic process and the rule of law. And of course, this is just simply not true. The U.S. government, through the U.S. NED, is funding organizations like Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, which, like we showed, is involved in virtually every aspect of the anti-government protests right now. And we showed how the U.S. State Department provided support in the form of handing out awards to members of the Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. So the U.S. is doing exactly what it did in Hong Kong. It just denied being involved in the protests until they had the leaders of the protests parading around Washington, D.C. And then, and only then, did they admit that they were funneling millions of dollars into Hong Kong in an attempt to peel it away from China, basically, and just destabilize the city as much as possible. And this is exactly what's going to happen here in Thailand. Until people start exposing it and talking about it and raising this issue and holding these protest leaders accountable. Because remember, it's easy to get angry at the kids out in the street, but they're being lied to by their protest leaders. Anon Nampa lied to the public and said he was not receiving U.S. government money. And clearly the organization he works for is. And nothing he is doing would be possible without this money. So protesters need to ask their leaders why they're being lied to. And people who oppose the protests need to realize how dangerous this is, because this isn't just internal politics in Thailand. This is a foreign government funding organizations who are trying to overthrow the Thai government and divide Thai society. Just look around the world where the U.S. has intervened, and you'll understand why this is so dangerous for Thailand. A couple of examples come to mind: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Yemen, Ukraine, Hong Kong. These are all places the U.S. has intervened. These places are not better off now than they were before the U.S. interfered, and Thailand won't be either. Help spread this information. Look in the video description below for all the references to everything that I just showed you. And please like and share the video. And thank you for watching.